When you're buying a very fancy car, chances are you're very rich, and you're not really going to race your car, so it's all about the stats that matter, even if you never achieve them. And out of all the stats that are the unobtainables for 99.9% of humanity, the one that sticks out the most is top speed. And from the humble beginnings with the first car to the latest 2,000 horsepower hypercars of today, it certainly has evolved, and today, that's what we are going to look at. The evolution of the production car speed record. The first thing to know about speed records is that there are a lot of classifications, each one of them with a lot of rules. So for our sake, we are going to look at the production car speed record, not the outright car record. That belongs to the jet-powered Thrust SSC at eclipsing the speed of sound. No, these have to be production cars that anybody with a bog standard license can theoretically drive. That means they have to follow pedestrian safety laws, noise laws, emissions, the whole 9 yards. And they also have to build at least 25 of them in order to qualify as a production car. To be honest, each magazine seems to have a different amount stated for production cars, but the most widely accepted number that I can find is about 25. And there's a few other murky rules that we're going to get into later on in depth, things like a two-way run, so a two-way average for your run in order to be counted. And there's gray areas of modification where if a car has its own VIN number, like Roof, it's okay, but if the car is a tuner kit like Koenig, then it's not. And electronics limiter removals and other bits. It gets very complicated very fast, even with the narrow definitions we stated at the beginning. But let's start out with an easy one. The 1894 Benz Velo, because it's the first production car. Makes it easy to be the fastest production car in the world then. It had a 64 cubic inch, one-cylinder engine making 1.5 horsepower. And that was good for 12 miles an hour, which seems, quite frankly, very slow. I'm pretty sure Usain Bolt can run faster than that. But look at the thing, it's a buggy. I wouldn't want to go 5 miles an hour in that. That looks absolutely terrifying. But then, as new cars were developed, the record changed hands practically every day, so we're going to skip to the first long-standing production car record. In 1949, Jaguar launched the XK120, named for its design top speed of 120 miles an hour. Its 160 horsepower inline-six engine propelled the streamlined roadster to 125 miles an hour. Jaguar deserves a little pat on the back for exceeding design expectations. It also exceeded the production car minimum of 25 easier than any other vehicle on this list. It clears it by 11,975 cars. It was a very popular vehicle. And the XK120 definitely had more to give, with modified versions hitting a two-way average of 172 miles an hour in 1953. But again, this does not count because Jaguar never actually made any versions of that specific vehicle, so it's not a production car. If they had, they would have blown the next few records out of the water, because just 6 years later, Mercedes came back swinging with the gorgeous 300 SL Gullwing. With a beautiful aerodynamic coupe and a 212 horsepower engine, the Gullwing blew past the XK120 to become the first car to crack 150 miles an hour when it averaged 150.7 in 1958. Now I know you're thinking, this is a 1955 record and is classified as a 1955 record, but it wasn't run until 1958. That's a bit of a discrepancy. Well, a lot of these tests, certainly I'm going to be talking about later, were run long after the car was produced. However, if it's a model year that we're tracking, it's not the actual date the record was set. So if you ran a car in 1958 that was a 1955 model year, then the record would be counted as 1955 for like the vehicle year, because theoretically, if you actually run that car in 1955, it would have set the record. So that's the little clarification there. And Mercedes also marked a significant improvement in handling as technology began to catch up with the engine size, and that was proved just 1 year later when Aston Martin revealed the DB4 GT. It was a lightweight performance version of their DB4, and it was a fantastic machine. Its 3.8-liter inline-six had twin spark plugs, dual Weber carbs, and a higher compression ratio to make 300 horsepower. And it was 1 mile an hour faster, 152 miles per hour, but it's still a record. And in fact, the limited run GT variant of the DB4 was 22 miles an hour faster than the normal DB4, and only 75 of them were made. That makes it one of the more expensive cars on this list, with an auction price of $5.4 million. And Aston Martin would keep the record for 4 years before the Italian design firm Izzo got involved. Now, Izzo had been making the bubble car since 1953, and they wanted to branch out into the actual car market. So they decided to do the only logical first step and make a sports car. So they partnered with GM to buy some 5.4-liter V8s and paired them with an Italian sports car chassis of their own design. The result was the 360 horsepower Izzo Grifo GL in 1963, and its top speed of 161 miles an hour. It broke 160 miles an hour here, fellas. But here's where things get confusing. Because in the mid-1960s, the Americans came a knocking as the muscle cars went very fast as power levels rose. But keeping track of these speeds and their legality in the record books proved too complicated for my American comrades, as some people confused the 200-mile-an-hour Charger Daytona NASCAR with the rodeo counterparts, which were significantly slower, and both the Shelby 427 Cobra and the Studebaker Avanti both have alleged top speeds in excess of 165 miles an hour, with some saying the Avanti was nearing 180 miles an hour. But there aren't any hardcore data points and records and verifications that you need for this to show that these stock vehicles did actually break the record. Studebaker was verified, however, the Bonneville Salt Flats car was lightly modified, so we're going to skip all that and move over to the 1968 Lamborghini Miura. It's one of the greatest cars of all time and the inventor of the modern supercar. It had the styling, the sound, the handling, and specifically the speed of a supercar in this case, 171 miles an hour to be precise. And that record lasted a whole few months before the 1968 Ferrari 365 GTB4 went 174 miles an hour, so eat it, Lamborghini. Granted, I would argue the Miura was actually a better car since it could handle on top of being fast, while the Daytona was more of a soft grand touring car in the corners. So it was a bit of a boat. And Lamborghini agreed, and the 1969 Miura P400S went 179 miles an hour. And then they proceeded to break their own record in 1982 with the Lamborghini Countach LP500S. And things only got faster when Group B took hold in the 80s as its road racing subdivision spurred on increasingly faster machinery. First, there was the 1984 Ferrari 288 GTO. It's a homologation special version of the 308, and it's one of the most underrated Ferraris of all time. I absolutely adore its looks, and it had a 2.9-liter twin-turbo V8, making nearly 400 horsepower and 366 torque. And it launched it up to 185 miles an hour. Unfortunately for Ferrari, Porsche were also interested in the Group B craze, and they are not known for half measures. The 959 was a Le Mans winner, a Dakar winner, and the most technologically advanced car ever seen to that point in 1986. And with a 444 horsepower sequential twin-turbocharged flat six, it was also the fastest production car in the world, with a top speed of 198 miles an hour, and with that, the race to 200 was well and truly on. And Ferrari were the first, with the F40, itself an evolution of the 288 GTO, when it hit 201 miles an hour in 1987. Or did it? Because no customer car, or indeed any F40 outside of Italy, ever hit that figure. I don't know why there would be such a strange discrepancy. I mean, it's not like Ferrari has a history of modifying their press cars to artificially inflate their performance numbers because they're too insecure of their own designs. They obviously don't do that. So the fastest any customer F40 has ever gone in a verified test was at a car and driver event in 1987, where it clocked 199 miles an hour. And while it's still faster than the Porsche, it actually wasn't the fastest production car in the world. That honor would go to another car at another magazine event. The newly certified German manufacturer Ruf deserves a video all on their own, but in the meantime, to simplify them, they build higher performance versions of 911 chassis. They get shipped blank base model 911 frames from Porsche, and then they do their magic to them. And that actually makes them their own manufacturer, despite being technically based off of Porsche. And their latest project in 1987 was the Group C Turbo Ruf, or CTR, and it had a vivid yellow paint job for that test, and that helped it be very visible as it drove past the 959, past the F40, past the 200 mile an hour barrier, and onto 211 miles an hour. Road and Track editors called it a yellow bird dashing across the horizon, and the CTR has forever been associated with the yellow bird name. In my opinion, it's one of the greatest cars, certainly of the 80s, and it made Ruf a household name, bruising the egos of big brands with just a 911 chassis and a custom 500 horsepower flat 6. And none of those brands would be able to touch it for years. Ruf would hold the record until the 1990s, when it was well and truly shattered by a newcomer. But before we talk about that car that everybody already knows about, we have to bring up the Jaguar XJ220, because its story is very relevant for the future. In 1991, Jaguar took a pre-production XJ220 to 212 miles an hour. A new record for sure, but it was still shy of their 220 mile an hour goal. So they removed the catalytic converter and the rev limiter. Those two changes gave an estimated 50 horsepower bump on some XJ220 versions, and that modified car hit a verified 217.1 miles an hour. But it was modified, so it shouldn't count. But on the other hand, catalytic converters were not required in Europe, and removing the rev limiter doesn't actually change any components. So the XJ220 kind of exists in this sort of gray area for the records. But people didn't seem to care about any of that, and the XJ220 proceeded to set the precedent that removing the rev limiter was not illegal in the hunt for the fastest production car. Which brings me to the McLaren F1. The McLaren Formula One team and their designer Gordon Murray built the ultimate road car. It had 3 seats, carbon fiber monocoque chassis, butterfly doors, and gold foil surrounding the BMW-developed 6.1-liter naturally aspirated V12. Some of the engine components were even cast from magnesium. The cylinders are cast from aluminum and coated in Nikasil to reduce wear. It sounds very fancy and very expensive. It's basically a road version of the V12 LMR Le Mans engine. That meant it made 618 horsepower without a turbocharger in sight, and a car with a drag coefficient of just 0.32. The XP5 prototype was run in 1994, and Autocar stated that if they had had enough runway, they could have hit 230 miles an hour. So, 4 years later, Andy Wallace went to Volkswagen's high-speed test track with XP5. But now, it had a rev limiter of 8,300 RPM instead of 7,500 RPM, giving it the full 618 horsepower, and Wallace drove XP5 to a two-way average of 240.1 miles per hour. That was the average. He hit 243 at VMAX. Bear in mind that the previous record couldn't crack 220. That was 23 miles an hour faster than the XJ220, and at those speeds, 23 miles an hour might as well be light speed. And it did this without forced induction in a car from 1993. It would hold the outright record until 2005. But today, in 2022, it is still the fastest naturally aspirated car in the world. And I don't see that falling anytime soon as turbocharging becomes more and more common, and you pay a high price for that title, as in $20.5 million at auction. But I did say that the record was finally beaten in 2005, ironically by Volkswagen. They tested the McLaren at Volkswagen's test track, and in 2005, Volkswagen used that test track and the Bugatti Veyron to hit 253 miles an hour. Granted, it took a hell of a lot of work to do that. An 8-liter W16 quad turbocharged engine with all-wheel drive to make 987 horsepower. Now, the main difference here is that the Veyron is no stripped-out race car, or indeed crazy lightweight supercar like the F1. No. It has actual amenities. It's coated in leather, and it's very, very comfortable. In fact, at normal speeds, it's downright luxurious. And at top speed, it's also luxurious. James May said the only problem at speed was a slight wobble under braking when the air brake deployed. Unfortunately for Bugatti, their ultimate record was broken just 2 years later, by an American no less. The SSC Ultimate Aero Twin Turbo used a twin-turbocharged 6.3-liter V8, making nearly 1,300 horsepower, which made the Aero hit an average of 256 miles an hour, or just 3 miles an hour faster than the French, Italian, Germans. They only made 31 of them, but it is still a production car, and therefore Bugatti had to respond. So they made an even more excessive version of their already excessive hypercar, the Veyron Supersport. The Supersport made 1,184 horsepower, and an even more aerodynamic body pushed it up to 268 miles an hour. Even the convertible version, the Grand Sport Vitesse, hits 254 without a roof. And this time around, it did the job. The record stuck all the way to 2017 when Koenigsegg arrived in dramatic fashion. Now, Koenigsegg had already made a name for themselves by 2017 with the Agera, but the Agera RS cemented them as one of the premier hypercar manufacturers. 25 of them were produced, and all of them had 1,341 horsepower with a single objective in mind: beat Bugatti. So they went to an empty Las Vegas highway and hit 271 miles an hour, and then 285 miles an hour on the way back, or, for the record, an average of 278 miles an hour. I said it with the F1, but going 10 miles an hour faster than the previous best is an insane figure. The faster you go, the more air resistance you get, so it is an exponential curve. It requires more and more power and more effort to brake each mile an hour, so going 10 miles an hour faster than 268 is an incredible achievement, and it wasn't their only achievement that day. They broke their own 0 to 400 kph record, and their own 0 to 400 to 0 record, and shattered a nearly 80-year-old record for the fastest speed ever on a public road. So there you go, not a bad weekend. And with the 278 mile an hour run, manufacturers began focusing on the next race. The race to 300 miles an hour. And it was going to be between Bugatti, Hennessy, Koenigsegg, and SSC. In 2020, the new SSC Tatara went to that same Las Vegas highway and averaged 316.11 miles an hour to enormous celebrations and scrutiny. Remember how I said that being 10 miles an hour faster is almost unheard of? Well, being 38 miles an hour faster seems downright unbelievable. So the internet did some digging, and things did not seem to add up. Since they used the exact same stretch of road as Koenigsegg, people were able to compare the time taken between landmarks against the Agera RS and the Tatara. And it didn't seem that much different, certainly 316 miles an hour. Now, SSC initially defended their record, claiming that their data was independently verified. But then the group that they cited actually denied the claim that they verified it, and that's when SSC came clean. Not only did it fail to hit 331 miles an hour, that was the VMAX they allegedly hit, it couldn't even crack 300 miles an hour one way. Now, that set them back a lot, and it really put a stain on the brand and the Tuatara as a whole. So much so that in 2022, they did verify it for realsies this time at 295 miles an hour, but nobody really cares anymore. One, because they haven't actually delivered any cars yet, so it's not a production car yet, that's just their working prototype of a production car. And two, Bugatti came along, because they released a modified version of the Chiron called the SS300 Plus. That 300 Plus stands for their speed record of 300 miles an hour or more. And by more, I mean 304.773 miles an hour at the test track for Volkswagen. Now, it's not an official record because they only did it one way, but semantics. They made 30 production cars that are limited to a measly 273 miles an hour. However, you can have the ability to turn it off if the owner elects to run at the Volkswagen test track, which is the only safe place you can actually run at 300 miles an hour. Yeah, they actually built a production car that you can buy, if they weren't already sold out, that goes over 300 miles an hour. But how? The Chiron had an already impressive, near 1,500 horsepower W16 engine, an evolution of the Veyron's engine. And the 300 Plus tuned it up to 1,600 horsepower. And it had a new long-tail body with specifically designed 300 mile an hour rated Michelin tires. Now the official record is still Koenigsegg at 278 miles an hour because it was both ways. And the official race for 300 miles an hour is still on the table, but frankly Koenigsegg has a bigger goal in mind. Forget the first 300 mile an hour road car, that was already claimed by Bugatti, whether it's legitimate or not. Instead, Koenigsegg is going for 500 kph. That's 311 miles an hour, because, I don't know, it's a nice even 00 number, but it's European and it's still feasible for a road car, so I guess that's the record there. So, in order to tackle that record, Koenigsegg built the Jesko Absolute in 2020, and unlike the other handling-focused Jesko Attack, the Absolute has a low 0.28 drag coefficient and a center-mounted rear fin to keep the car straight at high speeds. And to power it, Koenigsegg uses their own twin-turbo 5-liter V8 running on E85 to make 1,600 horsepower. Right now, they just have the working development car built in April, and it will probably get a top speed run coming in a few months. But we can find an estimated top speed with maths. If you factor in the drag coefficient, the surface area, the gearing, the power, and a few other things, you can estimate pretty close to the top speed of a vehicle. And Koenigsegg's estimates put it between 330 and 350 miles an hour. Think about that. In just 128 years, we have gone from 12 mile an hour single-cylinder carts all the way up to potentially 350 mile an hour twin-turbo hypercars that can cover a football field in just half a second. And at the rate of technological progression, who knows where we'll end up.